what I would think of moderately distinguished panel. My name is Mike Raycraft. I'm a clinical associate professor in the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism. My colleagues tonight, and we'll talk to them in a bit, Chris Willis, archivist, researcher, pioneer football scholar with NFL Films, and my friend Ed Sherman, retired Chicago Tribune sports writer, Daily Illini alum, and an adjunct faculty in the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism. Before we kind of begin our conversation tonight, too, I'd like to recognize and thank Illini Media and the Division of Intercollegiate Athletics for supporting us and our cause and our conversation tonight. It's definitely a privilege to be here. I get first dibs. A couple of things that I wanted to say kind of before we reach and talk about who clearly star of the show here, right? The Wheaton Iceman, Galloping Ghost, Red, Harold, Red Grange. But before we start to talk about Red, I do think it's important that we recognize George Huff. George Huff, for those of you who have taken my classes, and I know there's many of you who are here that already know, Champaign native, former student athlete. He was the head baseball coach, the head football coach. He was actually the manager of the Boston Red Sox for a period of time in 1907, which you can ask Mike Pearson about that later. He could probably tell you the whole story. It didn't last very long. He was kind of the Theo Epstein of his time, though. They called him the professor when he was with them. Actually, they were the Boston Americans back then in 1907. But most importantly to our story, he was the athletic director at the University of Illinois from 1901 to 1935. And one of the things that I like to talk about in class, and I'm gonna quote actually a coach from another Big Ten school, so I apologize for that in advance that we're playing here up here in November the 2nd. And the line that we use a lot, and I'll say, is great moments are born from great opportunity, right? One of the great sports speeches probably ever delivered by Herb Brooks. Well, I think about that in deference to George Huff. George Huff was a visionary. George Huff saw an opportunity for college athletics and how what type of impact college athletics can have in higher education. George Huff saw what was going on in the East, in the Ivy League, Harvard especially, right, with development of big stadiums and the use of athletics to promote higher ed. He also had a pretty good idea of what was going on in Columbus and Ann Arbor in terms of what would the role be of college athletics. He saw this vision, and then he had a partner, and his partner in crime was one of the most eloquent head coaches in the history of the sport, in Bob Zuppke. Two men got together, fired the students. They built alumni clubs across the country. They traveled the country. They raised $2.5 million to fund the stadium. And that's something that I really didn't know until I really started looking at it in terms of they raised all the money themselves, which I think is particularly spectacular. George Huff oversaw the fundraising, the design, and the construction of the stadium, which Zuppke referred to, and I love this, as the silent sentinel over the great prairies of the Midwest. What a great line. When I think about George Huff, and I think we'll be talking about this tomorrow at the dedication ceremony, his commentary, he says, on October the 18th, 1924, tomorrow, 100 years tomorrow, this magnificent gift, students, alumni, and faculty, as their tribute to the valor of the Illini who made the supreme sacrifice. Stadium, I don't get to paraphrase George Huff very often, but I get to tonight, is the inspiration where generations of Illini will assemble to learn the traditions of a long ago past, to measure their spirit of devotion, spirits of those who we honor today, and to pledge their all to an enrichment of this spirit. The stadium connects the past with the present and the future, and is really a monument to that. So have a moment tomorrow when you're cheering the Illini to victory on Saturday. Take a moment and think about the sacrifice of the 189 fallen soldiers who the stadium represents, and maybe give George F. a nod too. And now we can move the story.
Mike, can I just add real quickly? Big Ten Network, I think Illinois, in conjunction with Big Ten Network, stadium narrated by my friend Ryan Baker, Chicago, and it's I'm not sure when it's running on Penn Network, but it is available on YouTube, and so just search for Royal Stadium, should be able to find it. It's really good. He kind of Mike knows a lot of the history. He was telling me about it, and I saw it just yesterday. History of this place and how it came up, but those really can't be under. It was a remarkable effort in it to get this stadium built. Unbelievable.
Well, it's a testament to the students came up with $700,000.
I mean, students, 1920.
Tuition was $30.
$30.
So that's pretty incredible.
Unbelievable.
So what you guys came for, right? Story starts in Forksville, Pennsylvania, doesn't it, Chris?
Happy to be here. Yeah. Born Harold Edward Grange in Forksville. Father was Jack Foreman. Stay at home. Grew up dogs, and he actually liked family had a tragedy. His mom Forksville did. Better, she started quite as passed away, and then Red, father, brother Garland, sisters, family there. And college star. Familiar with him, summer, dollars a last thing that sort of amazed me about Red at this, wrote about it. Delivery of ice, the sort of quotes of legs are your working hills or on delivering ice, 7,500 ice blocks, pairs, build your endurance and your legs. 20s, high school, he was a sophomore. Thinking that way, almost like the modern athlete today. If you want out every day, 12 months, said that, gave speech, got to work on. This was sort of all new back then, so and obviously he became probably the best player out of Page County. More average touchdown. Sort of caught the eye of Zup, actually I knew a little bit about Grange. Saw him in a track tournament, playing a state. sort of introduced himself. He's like, I think you can play at Illinois. Why don't you think about coming to Illinois? Because this is how they recruit. They didn't have recruiting across the country and recruiting services. He just had a track meet, and then he said goodbye. So Red, eventually said, I want to go to college, and most logical choice for him. Ventured in 22.
And I'll let when he came here, did Zupke know what he had? And is there a story that he kind of that he left the first practice that he thought that he wasn't good enough, and his fraternity brothers had to tell him to go back for the next day? I mean, there's some, I mean, some wild story. That's a crazy story.
I mean, it's tough to make up, but once he got on campus, they said, you're going out for football, and he really wanted to play basketball. Actually, a really good basketball player, and he's like, I'm kind of small. Frat brothers. Walks down the up kid program. Walks back. Right in the pack. Oh, there's a. Okay, I'm.
So in 23 was a player. He wasn't, start noted.
Came was on All American sophomores. Upke built his off. Probably yes, yeah, yeah. And he got him started, and then the rededication game here on October 18th was the one they circled. I was telling the story in Michael's class again this afternoon, and Grange would always tell the story, and this is what made Zupke sort of a brilliant coach. Is he was like, oh, it wasn't one day that I arrived in Wheaton for the summer that I was getting these letters, from Zupke saying Yost was making these comments. They weren't fit to be in the Big Ten. They couldn't beat Michigan. Michigan's too powerful. His speed would get overwhelmed by their power, and Grange's like, oh, we got. I was getting so mad, not really at Michigan, but at Yost for writing all this stuff bad about me and my team. And then he says, oh, we get back on campus to start training camp, and we find out that Yost was out of the country. He was in Europe. You know, he's like, no, he's not writing letters. But Zupke was playing mind games. He wanted his team to be mentally ready, and then he'll get them physically ready to play Michigan. And obviously, that day was just
So, Mike, why don't you set up the stadium, the first game, you know, as far as,
Well, okay.
I mean, they had, you know,
Yeah,
all the people that were here.
Let's talk about that. So let's talk a bit
'Cause
about
that was part of the story, too.
the pomp and circumstance of that game on game day. And actually, the person I should talk to is actually sitting out here in the audience, and he's like, "Oh, please don't do that." But he knows more about it than I do, so I'm gonna put him on the spot. He's a pro. Mike, would you mind talking a little bit about from your perspective about the, I'm talking about 19. I'm talking about October, the dedication game.
Mike, this
on
sets up the amount of people that were here, and I mean, it was unprecedented.
Really? They're all here.
Ground was broken on September of 1922. The very first game was played 14 months later.
But the
14
stadium was
months.
not finished, though. At
The
the time.
stadium was not finished at that point. So, and the colonnade was not present at that juncture. So people were walking up and seeing this great facility, but there was no colonnade at that juncture. So now you get to, so now they had most of 1924 to finish the stadium. And there was a lot to finish at that point, because if you look at pictures of the very first game in 1923, there were big sections that weren't even done. And, you know, it was a big muddy mess. But the stadium came together in that summer of 24, and the colonnade was put in place just about 2 months before the first game. So it was basically right up to the end, to October 18th of 1924, when the stadium was actually, the finishing touches were put on.
And they had 67,000 people. You know, I mean, it was an amazing crowd, and you know, that's part of the story. You know, as far as it was unprecedented for this area to have that many people at a college football game.
Well, it was such a perfect storm of
It's unbelievable.
with you know, and one thing we really haven't talked about, and Ed's going to talk about this a bit at the end, in terms of media, in terms of, you think about the birth of sports media nationwide with radio and syndicated newspapers and whatnot. So you've got the entire state, you've got the entire media stage, you've got the number 1 and number 2 teams in the country, you've got Michigan and Illinois and Fielding Yost and Zupke, and all these things are going on. It's a perfect storm of everything kind of came together on this one day here, and then Red Grange gives the performance that he did in front of it. Just at the perfect, he had the perfect performance at the perfect moment in time, which made him a legend.
So let's just put it for people, put it in perspective. Michigan comes in here, a 20-game unbeaten streak. They tied 2 games in there, I think. They had given up during that 20 games, I think they had outscored their opponents something like 420 to 23 or something like that.
I think gave up maybe 1 touchdown.
1 or 2 touchdowns during that whole thing. Okay, so, I mean, you're not talking about just an ordinary, you're talking about a powerhouse. You're talking about, you know, this is like a super team. I mean, and that's what makes what he did. And, you know, and they thought they were going to come in and put Grange in his place. Fielding Yost had that. He did have a quote saying that we're going to take care of, and he wasn't even the coach. It was the one year he took a year off to become athletic director, so he wasn't even coach that year. I can imagine what he said to the coach.
He was on the sidelines just doing it
Yeah,
the
right.
entire time.
Right. So, but they come in here as these, you know, I mean, you imagine, I mean, they gave up 2 or 3 touchdowns in 20 games. And then what happens? Let Chris take the rest of the story. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, well, as we're talking, this is 100 years ago. Like, we're still talking, we're still in awe of Red and what he did that day. You know, it's like you mentioned, it was a perfect storm against a really great opponent. You know, like I said, it was not just.
More than great.
Yeah, this was an elite team that they were playing. And I mentioned the mental games that Zupke played, and they also did it, X's and O's. If you watch some of the footage, a lot of Grange's success was running around ends. He was the fastest, back in college football. So they would, snap, and he would just do end runs, and he would, he'd get 15, 20, 30 yards, and then eventually, get knocked out of bounds or go long distance. And so during that summer, he actually mentioned to Red, why don't you work on a cutback? And he's like, oh, you want me to work on a cutback, but they can't catch me if I go around in. You want me to cut back? And he was like, yep, you're going to hit the end, and then you're going to cut back across the field. And he had never done that. So if you were a scout in 1923, some of these universities had advanced scouts. They would show up at colleges, and he's like, oh, no, he just runs around the end. If you can stop him, that's why Stagg always thought, oh, we just stop around the end. Well, lo and behold, opening kickoff, he catches at the 5-yard line. He runs. You see it in the grainy footage. There's actually some grainy. Runs right to the right and then cuts right back across the field. Nobody there, because everybody just sort of sprinted to the sidelines. He goes 95 yards for a touchdown. And we haven't talked about rules a little bit, but the rules of the day then, which would just be dumbfounded today, is because you played for field position. So if you're Michigan, you're allowed to kick the ball back to the team because you want them to be deep and then punt the ball back to you, because that was the normal thing. So they actually kicked back to Illinois. We want to play position or a field position. He's not going to run 95 yards against us again. Well, lo and behold, second play, he runs 65 yards for a touchdown using the cutback. He cuts back across the grain, and so Michigan's like, no, he's not going to do a third time. They actually kick it. And literally, like 2 or 3 plays, he runs 50, and then I think they kind of figured it out. Like, wait a minute, are we going to be still stupid, or are we going to? But lo and behold, he does it again, and they 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes, probably against the best team of at least the last 15, 20 years in college football. He scores 4 touchdowns in the first, and then he's tired. He's like, oh, I got to come out. And he gets to the sidelines. He's like, "Oh, I'm tired. Up. You got to put somebody else in." He's like, "Well, that last run you didn't do right anyway. So go sit down." He's like, "Oh, I just scored 4," and he's yelling at the one thing I did wrong. So,
yeah, I mean that's the incredible thing, and I want to say Chris has a great book, and I learned a lot more. I thought I knew a lot, but I learned a lot from reading Chris's book, and I just reread it prior to coming here today. But he didn't play the entire game. He sat out the second quarter. He scored another touchdown early in the third quarter, his 5th touchdown. He counted for 402 yards of offense, right? 402 yards of total offense. And he threw 1 touchdown, just for good measure, right? And then he didn't play again. He barely played the rest of the game. He did all of this basically in a quarter, less than 2 quarters, against the greatest team in college football at the time. So
I'll just make one point. If you don't know the rules back then in 1924 was if you exited the game, you couldn't come back that quarter. So that's why he went out in the first quarter. At the end of the first quarter, he had to sit out the second. He could come back in the third. He leaves, and he can't come back in the fourth. So that's why a lot of players play 60 minutes back then because the game was close. He was tired after running all those touchdowns. So if you know the rule, but if you don't, that's why he left the game.
You might want to question his training. He was 21 years old, and he couldn't run 100 yards a couple times. I mean, but anyway, so just to put that in context of, okay, he does these great things, and the perfect storm that Mike was talking about. This was also one of the first nationally broadcast games on radio. So again, one of the first nationally broadcast games on radio. So, back then, they obviously, it was all word of mouth or newspapers. But now this is for the first time people were able to listen to this game. And then this guy does this amazing thing in 12 minutes, 4 touchdowns, and 12 minutes, 5 altogether. And as Mike said, there was a lot of national press here. And obviously they go crazy over what happened. And back then, in the 20s, it was about, they were looking for heroes. They wanted larger than life people, and they made them heroes. And and you know, and so they, you know, they fell over themselves writing about this guy, and so all of a sudden this guy becomes, you know, he's right up there with Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey and Bobby Jones, the golfer. Almost overnight, he takes that stature. One of the things that I read in Chris's book that I had wrong in my Big Ten book, but that I had thought Grantland Rice wrote Grantland Rice, who was the big sports writer of that day. He was there was nobody ever even to compare. He wrote all over the country. He was a superstar. You know, he was I don't
He was a
even know.
poet.
The dean of sports writers. He was kind of like the oracle. He was the voice of God from sports writers, and he wrote a famous poem about Grange. Again, he wrote poems and basically called him a ghost, but he wasn't the guy who called him the Galloping Ghost. But he played on that, and I thought he was at the game. Here's another incredible thing that I learned from Chris's book. He was at the Army Notre Dame game in New York. Same day, that day, the Grange game happened. He happened to write the most famous lead in the history of sports, outlined against a blue-gray sky. You know, the four horsemen rode again, which is considered, younger people in here won't even know what the hell I'm talking about, but most of you guys have heard that line. That was considered the most famous lead in the history of sports. So that both those things happen on the same day in college football. It's pretty amazing. And so again, the radio and the media, it makes this guy into one of the iconic figures, sports figures in the 1920s in sports, just in that one game. But he had more. I'll let Chris. Let's go with 1925.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up the media. It was the story. It was a sort of the story of a lifetime for some of the sports writers. They're like, oh, we just witnessed, because that's what makes sports great. You just don't know what's going to happen. And so for them, they were like, oh, so they wrote about Red over and over, and he's sort of been elevated, and not just, you know, sports. Like, he was more popular than the President of the United States and any world figure. You know, people wanted to know what Red doing.
What was the famous line? He met Calvin Coolidge.
Oh yeah, he during the barnstorming tour, we'll come back. But the barnstorming tour, he went to all these cities to play pro football, and one was in Washington D.C. And there was a senator, McKinley from Illinois, and he was like, he visited Red at the hotel. They had some free time before the game in the afternoon, and he was like, would you like to go see the President of the United States? And Red was like, sure, let's go. You know, like, we just walk up. And so McKinley and Holiday was another representative. So they took him out to the White House. They stood in the atrium, I believe, and so they bring Coolidge out, and they say, oh, this is, Red Grange, George Alice of the Chicago Bears. And supposedly Coolidge said, oh, nice to meet you, young men. I always liked Animal Wax. And they're just and then they were stunned. They were like, thank you, President. And then as they left, they're like, he didn't even know who we were, and started laughing. So that was part of his tour. But like,
can you just, he played another famous game against Penn in 1925, and I think that's, again, that elevated.
Yep.
Can you set that up for us?
Yes. So after Michigan, he's an All-American again. He makes the Water Camp, which was the biggest All-American team at the time. But there were still question marks of how great Grange was and how good Illinois was. Even beating Michigan, being co-champions or what, there was still doubt of how good their program was, because the East Coast writers, which had the biggest influence, including Grant Rice, and the programs. I mean, some of our younger, guests here probably wouldn't think that Harvard and Yale and Columbia were the height of college football, but in the 20s they were the best football teams. Even though they play, now they're just they're academics. They don't take football quite serious, but in the 20s they did take football serious, and they were some of the top programs in the country. So Zupke, who's smart, wants to play Penn, in 1925. He knows he's only going to have Red one more year. So he works on playing a game against Penn, and the Penn coach, Charlie Rogers, says, yes, but you have to come out here. You got to come out to Philadelphia at Franklin Field. to play. So Zupke says, wherever, we're going to come out to Philadelphia in 1925. So another good pre-scouting sort of done by Zupke. They saw their weakness on defense. They kind of overshifted to the strength of the offense, which was typical. Single wing was strong on the right, then the defense would shift over because most likely you were going to run to the right. Same thing to the left. But Zupke had a design to have Grange run to the opposite side. So the strength of the offense is on the right. You only have like one blocker on the left. Well, Zupke would hike the ball to Grange. Grange would take like 2 steps and then go the other way. So they come out to Philadelphia. It rains all day Friday. It rains most of Saturday. They play on probably the most muddiest field you've seen. There's some few film clips, and he's playing in knee or ankle high mud, and he does these another kind of cutback, and he just dominates this really good Penn team on their home field. I think it might have been it wasn't the Champaign Gazette had the best headline. It said Grange 36, Penn 6, and that because he scored all the touchdowns. Penn only scored once, and then all the East Coast writers just sort of jumped out of the press box and said, "Okay, you were right. Chicago Tribune, you were right. This guy is great because he just dominated a Penn team," and that sort of leads into the end of 1925 and Red's big decision.
Yeah. So
Well,
go ahead, Mike.
hold on. So the other characters, so we've mentioned Zupke, we've mentioned Huff, we've mentioned Hallis. Max Pyle would be kind of a key person. At this point, he kind of enters the story. Let's talk a little bit about Max Pyle, who he was, and the analogy that I give in class for those of you that are keeping score is Elvis Presley had Colonel Parker, and a lot of you younger, saw the film, right?
Saw the movie. Yeah.
Well, Elvis, Max Pyle would be to Red Grange as Colonel Parker would be to Elvis in terms of management. So we talk about their meeting and kind of what that led to.
Sure. So Red, pretty much after 1924 game against Michigan, everybody knew who he was. They knew his face. They knew what school he went to, especially here in Champaign. Everybody knew where Red, what he was doing, which classes he was taking, which girls he might have been interested in. Like, they knew everything about Red. Like, he did not, I guess it'd be like Taylor Swift now. No private life, no nothing. You can't go anywhere. So Red was kind of like that here in Champaign. And one thing he really liked to do was go to the movies. So if you ever, what street is it on? If you ever go
Downtown
to the
Champaign.
Virginia Theater, that's the actual movie theater that C.C. Pyle owned and operated that Red would visit. So in 24 into 25, Pyle tried to become best friends with Red. And Red wouldn't say a bad word about anybody, would just be friendly. And also, hey, I get to go maybe see some free movies. He'd give him a free pass to get into movies. And Red liked that. So they sort of did become somewhat of a friendly relationship. And so one night, and Red would tell this story over and over. Like, Pyle said, "Oh, I want to meet you in my office. Come to my office." So so he'd go to his office and said, "How would you like to make $1 million?" And then Red was like, "No, what are you talking about? I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not that kind of player." And he's like, "No, not to throw a game or to play pro football." And he's like, "Red, that's one thing he did want to do. He did want to keep playing. He did not want to end his career at 22 years old. You got to think in 1925, pro football in the NFL was not highly thought of. Baseball was king, college football was king. The pure sport. Even horse racing, even boxing and golf were much more popular and well-respected sports. The NFL and pro football was still getting over. All they do is slug each other. They play for money. And that type of reputation. Well, Red wanted to keep playing. He's like, I'm 22. I'm at the height of my athletic ability. I want to keep playing. And I happen to have this really good skill that people and owners and fans might pay to see. Kind of like what Babe Ruth was going through in baseball and some of those sports that had professionalism. So he told Pyle, yes, I want to keep playing. And Pyle said, leave it to me. I'll sort of get you signed to a pro team. We're going to go on a barnstorming tour, and we'll make a bunch of money. And so Red said, okay. They shook hands, just shook hands, and then off Pyle went to sort of, hey, let me see who he signs with and go play pro football.
So he signs like right after his last game at Ohio State. He signs with Pyle, signs with the Bears, and as Chris wrote very nicely in the book, this was very controversial, and the college coaches were aghast that this great player was going to sully himself by playing pro football, because that was for, low class people, and it was kind of like the time at that time in golf. Bobby Jones never became pro because that was beneath him to play for money. You played for pride and honor, and the same thing was college football. Zupke was very upset. The Big Ten almost sanctioned. They considered sanctioning Illinois because this guy was going to be turning pro. It's pretty incredible. And as you wrote in the book, Grange, Zupke's getting on him for turning pro, and Grange turns the table on him and said, well, you make money coaching football. Why can't I make money playing football? And they had a famous falling out for a long time. Couldn't right. He couldn't answer it. And so I'll let Chris.
And that's a critical part of the story. I mean, you need to understand that Babe Ruth did not have an agent.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this was the first agent.
This was
really
the first agent-athlete type of relationship. Pyle came out as a vaudeville guy, as a theater guy, understood entertainment and that type of perspective. That had never been a case in sports. And so for Grange to do that is a seminal moment. Okay, that's key. And the other thing that would be a key fact at this point in the story is how low the NFL was considered in terms of, again, we've said this, it was beneath college football. The star players did not go. Zupke was aghast, and there are scenes where, Grange comes to the. I'm sure I've got a couple of Kiwanis members here. There's a scene where Grange comes back to the football banquet, and there's kind of a moment where they part ways, and it was not a friendly friendly.
Then Grange
leaving.
walked out of the.
Yeah,
He walked out of the banquet.
he walks out
because
and then,
Zupke starts going off on him turning pro. He walks out. It's incredible.
And keep in mind, the team, the last game, the college game that Grange played was in Columbus. The team came back to Champaign. Grange headed to Chicago and signed a contract with George Halas and Max Pyle, and didn't come back. And so that was the beginning.
And now, Chris, you got to talk about this tour, this crazy tour that he finishes a whole college season, and then Pyle sets up this tour of Grange to go across the country. I mean, crazy.
But a question before, and I'm on the no-fly list at the Football Hall of Fame because I ask these questions, and so I've got a guy from the NFL, and I get to poke at him in front of an audience. What was the average attendance of NFL football games prior to 1925?
4,000 to 5,000 would be average or above average. Yes, 4,000 to 5,000.
And then what happened?
Well, when Red played, first game was 32,000 at Wrigley. Then he gets 65,000 at the Polo Grounds in New York. He gets 70,000 in Los Angeles. Another 30 plus in San Francisco. So this barnstorming tour they went on, like Ed mentioned, was 18 games from, I think if I get the dates right, like November 25th was Thanksgiving. That was his first game against Chicago. The last game was February 1st. So you're talking, 18 games within that time period. And he's traveling the country. He's just not, only 3 of the games were in Chicago. The other 15 were, if I got it right, he goes like Chicago to St. Louis, Philadelphia to New York. Those were back-to-back games, Saturday, Sunday. Then he
Make a big deal about guys playing back.
Yeah.
On the NBA.
He goes back-to-back. Then they go to Washington like for a Tuesday game, Boston for a Thursday game, Pittsburgh for Friday, and then Detroit for Sunday. So that was all the first half of the tour. That was mainly the end of the NFL season with a few exhibition games in. And then Pyle, who didn't know anything about football really and how you schedule it, then learned a little lesson. They went down south, but these games were a week apart, so they weren't back-to-back games or 3 and 4 days. Then they do Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa, New Orleans. Then they go out west and do L.A., San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. You know, imagine doing that for NFL. Like, nobody cared about it. Like, those cities didn't even have NFL teams, you know, down south and out west. But they wanted to see Red Grange. It's almost like, oh, Babe Ruth is coming to our town, you know, on a tour. They would do those tours with Lou Gehrig. So all the fans wanted to see him. You know, they would pay, and especially in those bigger cities, they would pay to see him play. You know, so this elevated the NFL. You know, they finally had somebody who had a good reputation, that was a great athlete, but that people wanted to see. So it was the first time across the country that the NFL was on people's mouths in conversations, in newspapers, in these communities. Now, it still took another 40 years for the NFL to have, you know, 20 teams and the NFL merger. It took a while, but this was the first time that, you know, people read or saw newsreels or radio of the NFL, heard the NFL, and that pro football was sort of a good sport. It could be a good sport and a business.
Yeah, we were talking among us, we were talking about earlier about if you named the 3 most important people in the history of the NFL and developing the NFL, I would say you'd put Pete Rozelle, longtime commissioner, George Halas, who was kind of the founder of the NFL, and I think number 3 is Red Grange, because Red Grange really put the NFL on the map. I couldn't even, as we were saying, maybe throw in Vince Lombardi in there. We couldn't even come up with 5, you know. I mean, but Red Grange was definitely in the top 3 as far as being that guy, much like Babe Ruth was in baseball, you know, who really just was that people cared about, even if they didn't follow the sport, they knew of Red Grange. And, you know, that shows you the kind of impact that he had, that he really helped propel that sport to becoming, you know, he's one of the foundations of where the NFL is today.
So we have Grange, we have Butkus, we have Halas, we have Hugh Ray, who there's probably a few people here in the room here who knows who. Hugh Ray wrote the rules, right? I mean, Hugh Ray, these are all U of I alums. And this is why I go every year to the Football Hall of Fame and make a scene that we should pack up the bus. And why is this in Canton? The birthplace of football is really right here in Champaign, and this is where it should have been in 1963. And I say that because I mean it.
You know, and the other thing, a few years ago, they did the top players in college football history for one of the bowl games. I can't remember which one it was. Sugar Bowl, maybe the Sugar Bowl, right? Sugar Bowl. Illinois, I'll be honest, we've had some lean years. Mike Pearson and I covered a few, you know, around for, you know, we probably caused about 40 heart attacks last Saturday with blowing that game. It's not like we are a football powerhouse, but on that day where they had the greatest players in college football history, Illinois was the only school, I think, that had 2 players represented, Red Grange and Dick Butkus. And you think about it, and also think about the fact that in 2008, I think it was, ESPN did some kind of poll, who was the greatest player in college football history? Red Grange. So you think it's pretty staggering. And then Mike mentions that George Halas came here. It's pretty staggering that for a school that, you know, it's kind of had some good moments, some not so good moments, certainly not iconic moments like Ohio State and Michigan and some of the other teams, Notre Dame, that this program really produced some epic, legendary figures, and Red Grange is number 1. And I said to a Daily Illini reporter the other day who talked to me about this program, and I said, you know, you guys probably walk by that statue of Red Grange outside, you know, every time you guys go to a game. I said, we're going to tell you why that statue's there, and you know, that was kind of our goal today. I mean, just an incredible game, and as Chris said, it's 100 years later. 100 years. What are we talking about what else are we going to talk about 100 years from now in sports? Maybe we'll talk about Michael Jordan. But who else? What else are we going to be talking about 100 years from now? I don't know about Tony, who knows? Maybe Jordan, maybe Secretariat, the horse race, maybe, I don't know, But we're talking about this 100 years later. It's just staggering, and it shows, like Babe Ruth, there's very few athletes that we still talk about, and that most people, even younger people who don't, at least they've heard their names. Jesse Owens, I think we're going to be talking, about him, and Jackie Robinson, but very few athletes. But 100 years later, it's just staggering that we're talking about him, and it's still very relevant because his impact is still being felt today.
Let's talk a bit about the impact of the barnstorming tour in terms of his NFL career, and kind of what were the implications to that, maybe long term.
Yeah, I think with Red turning pro, the first thing he did was encourage other All-Americans to play the sport. There was sort of not a huge snowball, but a snowball effect that some players say, well, if the NFL and pro football is good for Red, because Red had a sterling reputation and was the best player coming out of college football history, then it could be good for me. And so players like Ernie Nevers and George Wilson, they were players that actually played against Red on the barnstorming tour that had just finished their senior year. Now the colleges and the college coaches did not like that, because they would just leave school and they wouldn't finish their degree. So there was actually a rule in the spring of '26 that was actually called the Red Grange rule, is you had to your graduating class had to finish before you could play pro football. And so if somebody entered, University of Illinois in the fall of '26, quit a month later, he couldn't play in the NFL until 4 years, until his class had graduated. So this was sort of a peace offering to the colleges that the NFL did, and it lasted pretty much until the late '80s, when Barry Sanders was the biggest name, saying, "I would like to go as a junior." So he goes, and now 3 years removed from high school, you can be draft eligible. So just right off the bat, he had a lot of influence on the players that coming in and how their eligibility was. And then I think the thing that I mentioned in my book that I think is not only just here at University of Illinois, but for the NFL, he was the blueprint of what the modern athlete is today, and has been over this last 100 years. He was an All-American college player. He set records and won games. He turned pro early. He had an agent. He did endorsements. He did movies. He became an all-pro player, and he won 2 NFL championships with the Bears in 1932, 1933. So that's Tom Brady. Tom Brady has 6 rings, but that's Peyton Manning. That's the modern athlete. That's Jim Brown. That's Johnny Unitas. And he did this in 1923, 24, and 25. He did it 100 years ago, saying, you know what, this is what a modern athlete can do. Now we praise him. Tom Brady gets praised all the time. Peyton Manning, his career. Well, in 1925, Red had started to do it, and sometimes he got criticized, sometimes he got praised. But I think he set the blueprint. And then later in his career, his post-career, he set the blueprint for the athlete to sort of have a successful career off the field. He became a coach with the Bears. He didn't particularly like the pressure of coaching. Eventually he said, all you do is coach and then you get fired. So he did not like that as much. So after he went into broadcasting, he was the first ex-player to do radio. He did TV when TV became the norm. And then he retired in 1963 after the Bears won George House's last championship. So he's retired. He is a Pro Football Hall of Fame charter enshrinee. He's a College Football Hall of Fame enshrinee. He helps the retired players who were the pre-59ers. If you don't know that, the pension did not give funds to players who played before 1959. So he fought for that in the 80s. They eventually got it. He didn't need the money. He was okay, but there were guys who had played in the 20s and 30s and 40s who actually needed some help. So he fought for that, and he just became an icon of the NFL and of football and of sports. And that's the blueprint. No, that's the blueprint of what, if you said that to Tony Romo, yeah, I'll take it. I'll do TV. I'll do this. I'll do that. Tom Brady, they will take that as a post-career. Well, he did it way before the playing career and post-career. And I think that's his, like I said, that's one of his greatest legacies is being able to show, how you can be successful, as a football player and post-career.
Before we break up, are there anybody who'd like to ask any questions? We're going to do kind of a Phil Donahue style, if that's okay.
So on this barnstorming tour, and they're going to these places on the West Coast where they don't have teams. Who are they playing?
That's actually a very good question. So at this time, like I mentioned, Pyle set these games up. Like he actually went out to L.A. at the beginning of the tour. He actually left the tour, went out to L.A. in San Diego, and he got promoters. They would just field all-star teams. So in Los Angeles, there was a lot of USC, UCLA players. They actually paid George Wilson, who was a All-American at the University of Washington. He came down and played in 2 of the California games and then the Portland game. So it was pretty much, some ex-NFL players or some pro football players and then just former All-Americans. Some of them were better than others. The Los Angeles team was pretty good. The San Diego team, I believe the Portland team, they got beat 69-0, and they were not very good. So that might have been more Sandlot players and guys that might have played in high school and not even in college. So like even the Washington game, we talked about his visit to Washington, that was a lot of Sandlot players who might have played at Georgetown, and they beat up the Bears. That's when they started showing their wear and tear because they were playing every other day. They got beat up in Washington. Although they won the game, I believe it was like 19-0, they got beat up. Like there was some serious Sandlot guys that would just hit you. They didn't care if you had the ball or not. They would just hit you, So he started to wear himself out. Obviously, he got his elbow hurt in the Pittsburgh game, and he did not actually play in the Detroit game. So because he was too sore to play. So.
How long did it take?
Good question. Yep.
How long did it take before college athletes became mainstream NFL players?
Well, the draft didn't start till 1936, and even then, some of those players who were drafted in the early didn't even play in the NFL. We talked about it in this classroom. If you know Jay Berwanger, he was a All-American at the University of Chicago when they had football with Stagg. He was the first Heisman Trophy winner, and he was the first #1 overall pick. Well, he chose to sell rubber. He's like, I can make 10 times as much money selling rubber in Chicago than to playing pro football and getting beat up. So he didn't even play. So it really wasn't until probably, the 40s and maybe after World War II that consistently All-American players and players that had a reputation would go and play in the NFL.
The foam on your car when you shut your car door. Jay Berwanger made a ton of cash. He was a very interesting man. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
In the Michigan game, you went over that I think out of the first 4 times he touched the ball, he scored. And then all of a sudden, I heard that she didn't play, and I didn't really understand that. So I'm glad you went over that earlier. Tell me how that worked again. That if you got taken out, you couldn't play for a full quarter.
Yes. So the rule back then, and that's the reason why most players just stayed in. They didn't want to come, or they knew So if you came out in a certain quarter, you could not go back in. So if you, like Red did, he came out near the end of the first quarter. He was dead tired. And so he did not play the entire second quarter. And then so now he could have come back in the third or in the fourth. He chose to come back in the third, and then he scored again, and then he was taken out, I think, early in the fourth, so he couldn't come back in the fourth. So that's how it was. Now, most teams and players, they did not really come out. They only had, colleges had more players, but like the NFL, they only had 16 players. So most of the 11s play the entire game, and you just had a few backups. If somebody got hurt, then they would come in, but it wasn't quite as common. So it sounds weird, and it is weird, but it wasn't as common as you would think because most players played 60 minutes. And
did they play both ways?
They played both ways. So back then, I think it was Sammy Wall had a quote. It's like, you had to tackle. Like, you could be the best back in the world, But if you didn't tackle, you didn't play because you were not very good on defense. So they didn't want you on, like, so you could have been a mediocre running back, but you could tackle, be the best tackler, you were going to play, you know. So it wasn't until 1950 when they went single platoon and just one way. It would be considered like defensive halfback, so kind of like a safety, you know, or a corner. So, but they called him defensive halfbacks.
And you were saying he actually, at the end of his career with the Bears, he became one of the best defensive backs in football.
Yeah, you know, he injured his knee in 1927. He blew his knee out actually against the Bears, and he sat out 1928. So, but Hallis thought he could still play, and he was great to have around for the younger players, and he was professional. So he brought him back in 1929, and for the most part, he was an okay running back. He was not the breakaway threat that he was in Illinois, but he was the best defensive back. You know, there's quotes that I found from Curly Lambeau, Mel Hine, you know, Steve, like opponents, not just his teammates. His teammates said, "Oh, we could never throw. We threw away from him. You know, he would always be there with the ball. You couldn't throw over the top of him or trick him and throw a pass over top of him." And I think that's how he made his reputation in the NFL later in his career and the All-Pro teams was more for his defense than his offense.
Well, I think it's 7.
I have a two-parter, and one is, did he ever weigh more than 170 pounds? And part of that is, I've read that barnstorming tour, he just got the ever-living beat out of him. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe later in his career, he was probably 185. You know, I don't know if he ever got up to 190, but that, you're talking, 30 years older, and so, but 175 to 180 was mainly his playing weight, But the barnstorming tour, yes, because he played a lot. I mean, this is Pyle not knowing anything about football. A lot of times in his contract, he would say he'd play X amount of minutes, 30 minutes, 40, and because the fans wanted to see him, so he played a lot. And they, like I said, they were playing every other day. So, so after those first 5 or 6 games, he did get beat up. He had, and the worst one was a elbow injury that he actually, I think, received in New York. So he played like the next 4 games with a terrible elbow injury. And in Pittsburgh, on a snow field that was like hard as rock, first quarter, he lands on the elbow, and it destroys his ligament, and he sort of he's like, I can't. And Hal says, you got to go. We're destroying you. And the doctor looked at it and he's like, you need rest. So, as much as Pyle didn't want, he got overruled. He's like, no, he can play. Nope, we weren't going to send him out there. Actually ruined his career after like 8 games. So he did miss a game there at the end, and then he got a couple weeks rest before they went down to Florida, and the elbow got much better. But then they were only playing like 1 game a week on a Saturday or Sunday. It wasn't quite. I think it was one game or 2 that they played back-to-back days. The L.A. San Diego was back-to-back.
So let me relate one story. Who attended the Howard Griffith 8-touchdown game? Several people. Okay. As you remember, touchdown number 5 tied Red's single game record at Illinois. Number 6 tied Jim Brown's record. Number 7 tied somebody named Showboat Boykin from Ole Miss. Number 8, well, that was the record. And so I decided, and if you remember the 1990 season, we went on to be Big Ten champs, and we played in the, what was it called at the, no, not Citrus Bowl, the Hall of Fame Bowl in Tampa. And so, knowing that Tampa wasn't too far from Indian Lake Estates, where Red was, I decided, we've got to connect these 2 legends somehow. We've got to connect Howard Griffith and his record-breaking performance that year with Red Grange. And I called Mrs. Grange and said, can we make this happen? And she said, I'd love to see that happen, but Red is just not in good enough shape. Just can't do it. I'm so sorry. It would be wonderful to link them together. Well, about 2 days before we left for Tampa, got a call from Mrs. Grange, and she says, let's make that happen. So Dave Johnson, you may remember Dave's name, succeeded me, and I and Howard Griffith drove to, I think it was a Lake Wales hospital, where basically Red Grange was on his deathbed. And we walked in, and we really weren't sure what was going to happen. But I wanted Howard to, meet, this man whose records had been broken. And I said, Mr. Grange, I just want to introduce you to Howard Griffith. Howard's the guy who's been breaking all your records. And he says, and there was stone silence for about 30 seconds, and I'm thinking, well, he just didn't hear me. He's not with it. And a soft voice finally comes up and says, oh, I know who Howard is. and Griff's face lit up. By the way, do you know where Red Grange's remains are? They're right here. Right here. Northeast Tower. You know where the Grange Rock is? Myself, Patrick Hayes, Muggs, Margaret Grange brought Red's ashes, and we sprinkled them around the Grange Rock. So Red Grange is here.
I just want to follow up with Mike. That's awesome. His experience with Red is actually in the book, and I would like to thank Mike again for having those stories, because as a historian, those are priceless. Like I wasn't there, as much as I'd love to live in the Stone Age. Mike's stories like that, it's just so special, and like I said, it just made my day when he told me those stories, and they're in the book, and as a historian, like I said, you couldn't ask for better, experiences like that, and everybody has one in everyday life, and Mike was, more than happy to share them with me. So I thank him, for telling that story, because it means a lot to me that I was able to sort of bring that out to life a little bit. So it's
Mike's in my Big Ten book too. Mike wrote a first person for my book in that too, 'cause I knew the story.
Well, it's hard to beat the Red Grange Ashes story, isn't it? I would say this: couple things, opportunities we've got as we kind of conclude the conversation. There are 2 books. So Chris, we're fortunate to have our friends from the Illini Union Bookstore set up over here, where they've got Chris's book, Red Grange: The Life and Legacy of the NFL's First Superstar. In my opinion, is the definitive book on Red Grange that's ever been written. I don't think we ever need to see another one. Chris will be happy to sign it for you, right over there. In addition, and this is hot off the press, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to. There's a new book on Memorial Stadium, the University of Illinois Memorial Stadium of the first 100 years. How many of you guys were at Farm Aid? Raise your hand, I'm curious. Best day ever. Second day, Red #1, Farm Aid, Willie Nelson #2. The authors are here with us tonight, Kevin Henders and Benjamin Bross. You guys want to stand up real quick? Okay. So we're at the beginning of their author's tour, and their book is over there. I would highly encourage you guys, a great opportunity to check the book out, and then be pleased to sign it for you. Again, thank you for coming. What a fantastic evening. Great talking to you. I've enjoyed the questions. I always enjoy talking about Red Grange, as many of you know. So it's a pleasure. You guys have a great evening. Enjoy the dedication ceremonies tomorrow. ILL. All right. Thank you, and have a good night.
Oh, yeah.